In this video, we'll analyze 8 games, each in one of the most played openings by none other than Magnus Carlsen, a player known for his mastery of so many different openings. To start things off, we'll look at an opening that Magnus brings out every once in a while to surprise his opponent. It's B3, the Nimzowitsch-Larsen attack, an opening he's played 52 times in his career. This opening prepares to fianchetto the queen's bishop, where it will help control central squares while pressuring black's kingside. Black replies e5, taking the center that white left on offer, and white puts his bishop on the long diagonal, attacking the pawn. So black defends with knight c6. Then white pushes c4, finally establishing a pawn presence near the center. Black develops his knight to f6, and white plays knight f3, adding an attacker to e5. Black pushes the pawn, counterattacking the knight. Magnus centralizes his knight, offering an exchange, which black declines, developing his bishop to c5 with tempo. But this leaves the g-pawn undefended, and white goes after it with knight f5. Black ignores this hollow threat, lunging in the center with d5, while opening up an attack on the knight. White grabs the pawn with check, and the king slides over to f8, hitting the knight, who does not have a safe retreat square. Although white will lose a piece, his compensation lies in the form of a weak black king and a tremendous sniper bishop. Magnus captures the pawn on d5 with an attack on the knight, making use of the fact that black cannot recapture with the queen without hanging his knight, nor can he recapture with the knight without allowing white's knight to escape. So black plays bishop d4, trying to eliminate white's best piece, but white blocks this, developing his knight to c3. Black saves his knight, moving it to e7, threatening the d5 pawn. White follows with e3, attacking the bishop, and opening up the queen to support the white knight's bolt for freedom. This leaves black little choice but to capture on c3, forcing white to recapture, and he does so with the pawn, giving black the time to capture the knight, getting a piece for 2 pawns. Magnus pushes c4, reinforcing his tenacious grip over the center, while opening up his bishop, who peers menacingly at black's king. White has the resources to quickly build up an attack. So black moves his knight to g6, defending his kingside, which also opens up the queen's defense of the knight. While things appear to become more calm, the storm is just about to begin. g4 threatens g5 to win the pinned knight. Black tries desperately to stop this with h6, only to have this move met by h4, restoring the threat. Well, not really, because g5 would be met by a capture, exploiting the pin on the h-pawn to the rook. Now, until white gets his rook protected, black wants to capture the pawn on g4. But first, he must untangle, which will take a couple moves. Also, his knight is pressuring d5, so if the knight were to move, then white can leave his pawn loose for a move and push down the center. So black plays c5, stopping any white's pawn advances. Magnus develops his bishop to e2, and after black gets his king away, he plays queen c2, preparing to castle queenside. Black moves his rook off the diagonal, finally freeing up his knight to gobble the pawn, and white has no worry, casually castling queenside. Black takes the pawn, hanging his e4 pawn but threatening the pawn on f2. This demands a precise reply by white, and Magnus rises to the occasion, pushing h6, kicking the knight back to f8 before eating up the e-pawn. He can easily meet knight takes f2 with queen g2, forking the king and the knight. Black plays f5, kicking the queen, and while she could stick around, white decides to pull her back to c2, offering the pawn. Black happily obliges, giving white a semi-open c-file to work with. Magnus first shifts his rook to g1 with check, and thanks to white's eagle-eyed bishop piercing the long diagonal, black isn't really spoiled for choice. He marches his king to f7, and white swings his other rook to c1, attacking the knight. Black brings his queen in to defend, and white pulls out bishop e5, threatening to fork and win the knight. Black slides his queen to e4, hitting both the bishop and the pawn, but this is a fatal mistake. White defends both with queen c3, and we start to notice that black's queen is quite confined. The knight is still under attack, so it hops to h3, counterattacking the rook. And here, white has a phenomenal move to win the game. Can you find it? With black's queen running out of options and the white rook peering at the enemy king, the move Magnus plays is rook g4, exploiting the pin on the pawn to completely trap the black queen. This impels black to resign the game. In the second game, Magnus has the black pieces and meets c4 with c6. After d4, Magnus replies with his 7th favorite opening, d5, transposing into the Slav defense of the queen's gambit, an opening he has played 63 times. The Slav defense is a solid response to the queen's gambit. The c6 pawn supports the center without immediately blocking the light-squared bishop, and it also prepares to take on c4 and try to keep the extra pawn with b5. White proceeds development with knight f3 and black plays knight f6. White's e3 opens up his kingside bishop, and after black develops his bishop to f5, white captures the pawn on d5, clarifying the situation in the center. Black recaptures, creating a symmetrical pawn structure, and white develops the other knight to c3. Magnus next brings out his knight, and white plays knight e5. Now black does not take it because white recapturing would force the knight to retreat to d7 since it has to defend against bishop b5 check. This would disconnect the queen's defense of the pawn, allowing white to win a pawn. So black drops his other knight to d7, contesting white's powerful piece. This does allow white to take the pawn on d5, but black would regain it, capturing twice on e5. So white follows instead with queen b3, targeting the b-pawn and adding an attacker to d5, which black defends with e6. Then white greedily grabs the b-pawn with an attack on the black knight. Magnus saves his knight by capturing the knight in the center, and after white recaptures, he plays rook b8, activating his rook on the semi-open file, but giving away the a-pawn. White takes it, walking right into the hands of the black bishop, who swiftly swoops to c5. The queen flees to a4, pinning the knight to the king, and black gets out of this right away by castling his king to safety. White is up 2 pawns, and he could try to hold on to them both, but this would likely come back to bite him. The better choice is to catch up in development and get his king castled as soon as possible, so he wisely develops his bishop to e2. Black regains 1 pawn while centralizing his knight before white castles. Magnus balefully boosts his rook onto b4 with an attack on the queen, and she retreats to d1. Then black lifts his queen to f6, bringing another piece into battle. White's main advantage right now is his passed pawns on the queen side, so he begins pushing them with a3, hitting the rook. Black swings his rook over to h4, targeting h2, and white, in fear of additional attackers on his kingside pawns, like the bishop, plays g3 to tighten things up while attacking the rook. Black does not budge, shifting his queen a square to pin the pawn, and white presses on the opposite end with b4, hitting the bishop, who drops back 1 square, maintaining a fervent glare on the enemy king. Then white develops his bishop to b2, indirectly attacking the knight. But this move has a flaw, and black has 1 move to exploit it. Can you find the winning move? The white bishop had a critical duty of overprotecting the e3 pawn. With it gone, Magnus is able to gain the upper hand with the move knight g4. This attacks the indefensible h2 pawn a second time, and although it cuts off the queen's pin, the rook cannot be taken without allowing knight e3 a discovered check to win the queen. Now going back to the bishop. If it were still on c1, then white could capture the knight before playing f3 without hanging his e3 pawn. In this case, however, if white were to take the knight, then black would take back, hitting the queen, and regardless of white's continuation, white would not have a good way of stopping black's plan of bishop f3, followed by sacrificing the rook on h2 before bringing the queen to the h-file, leading to checkmate on h1. Instead, white tries bishop f3 in an attempt to support the weak light squares around his king, but white's position is about to fall apart. Magnus captures the crucial h-pawn, hitting the bishop, who drops back to g2. Black moves his bishop to g4, attacking the queen, and white slyly captures on d5, giving away his queen, but threatening to win it back with knight e7, a royal fork. Black, unfazed, takes the knight, and white recaptures with the queen, getting out of the attack. Finally, black saves his rook, moving it to h5, hitting white's queen, and white resigns. He has absolutely no way of both saving his queen and defending against the devastating threat of knight f3. White could try queen b7, but black would just follow with queenie f5, renewing the threat of knight f3. And remember that the f-pawn cannot move without hanging the e3 pawn. If white were to give in and take the bishop, then knight f3 would force the white bishop to capture the knight, leading to black's bishop landing on f3, and rook h1 checkmate would be unstoppable. In the next game, white starts e4 and Magnus replies e5. Knight f3 attacks the pawn and knight c6 defends. Then white moves the bishop to b5, playing the Ruy Lopez, to which Magnus replies with knight f6, the Berlin defense, an opening he's played 78 times. The Berlin defense is a natural way to meet the Ruy Lopez. The knight develops while attacking the e4 pawn, and the white bishop is left on b5, where it's slightly more vulnerable to attack. White castles, allowing black to capture the e-pawn, which he does. White follows with d4, trying to entice black to move the e-pawn so that white can pin the knight to the king. Capturing would be dangerous for black, so black retreats the knight to d6, attacking the bishop, who captures the knight on c6. Black has to recapture, giving white time to win back the pawn on e5 with an attack on the knight. Magnus moves his knight to f5, opening the queens to one another, and white exchanges them off, forcing the black king to go uncastled after he recaptures. Now we've reached what is known as the Berlin endgame. White's advantage is a pawn majority on the king side and a better pawn structure, whereas black has the bishop pair in a fairly open position. White starts with h3, stopping any black minor pieces from landing on g4 and kickstarting advances to his pawn majority. Black replies h6, stopping white's minor pieces from straying too far forward, before white slides his rook over to d1 with check. After the king sidesteps to e8, white develops his knight to c3. Magnus maneuvers his knight to e7, looking to reroute it, and white plays b3 to put his bishop where it will have the most scope. Black moves the knight to g6, pressuring e5, and white fianchettos the bishop. Black develops his bishop to e7, and white centralizes his knight on e4. Then black plays c5, staking a claim to the d4 square, but this weakens the d5 square, so the white knight hops right back to c3, looking to jump forward. Black moves his knight to f4, contesting d5, and white replies with a tricky move, e6. This sacrifices a pawn to give white an active position. Once black would take the pawn, white would have an open e-file to work with on top of his already open d-file, and his bishop would spring to life, all while his knight would still hop forward, lurking with threats. Magnus first plays f6, blunting the long diagonal, and after white shifts his rook to the e-file, he accepts the pawn sacrifice, capturing with his knight. White advances his knight to d5, pressuring the c7 pawn and threatening black's bishop pair. Black lifts his king to f7, paving the way for his rook to enter the game, and white moves his other knight to h4, looking to make use of weak light squares in black's camp. After black plays rook d8, attacking the knight, white captures the bishop, luring the king to e7, where it becomes a target for the white knight, who leaps to f5 with check. The king moves right back to f7, and white plays rook e2, stopping the black rook from infiltrating the second rank and preparing to double rooks. But this gives black one move to win the game. Can you find it? We notice that the white knight is undefended, and Magnus takes full advantage of this. The move he plays is knight f4, attacking both the rook and opening up an attack on the knight. So white resigns. Now white could try rook e4 counterattacking, but black would capture on h3 with check, grabbing a second pawn while shattering white's kingside, before regaining the knight. He would be up 2 pawns and soon to win more with a completely dominant position. In the fourth game, white starts d4 and Magnus replies knight f6. After white's c4 taking firm grasp over the center, black plays e6, opening up his kingside bishop. Knight c3 developing is met by Magnus's fifth favorite opening, bishop b4, the Nimzo-Indian defense, which he has played 80 times throughout his career. By pinning white's knight, black prevents e4 and plans to give white doubled pawns. White continues knight f3 developing, and black plays b6, preparing to fianchetto his light-squared bishop. White's e3 opens up his bishop, and black plays bishop b7, placing it on the long diagonal, before white puts his, where it stares down the black kingside. Then, both sides castle. Magnus lunges forward with c5 to exchange a flank pawn for a valuable central pawn. White follows with knight a4, eliminating black's prospect of giving white doubled pawns, before black captures on d4 and white recaptures with the pawn. Black shifts his rook over to e8, opening up the square, so that after white plays a3, kicking the bishop, black can tuck it in nice and snug on f8. After white develops his bishop to f4, black sees a nifty combination to develop with tempo. He captures the knight on f3, removing the defense of d4, and once the queen recaptures, he develops his knight to c6, attacking the pawn. White pushes d5, hitting the knight. Black captures, opening the e-file for his rook, and white recaptures. Then black leaps his knight onto e5, attacking both the queen and the bishop. Now white should definitely take the knight, but he decides to preserve his dark squared bishop by retreating his queen to d1. This is a huge mistake, and black has a clever winning combination. Can you find it? To find the move, we must notice that the bishop and the knight are almost completely unprotected, and on the same rank. Magnus certainly notices this, and the move he plays is knight takes d3. White has to recapture, otherwise he'd be down a piece, and the follow-up is rook e4, with a double attack on the bishop and the knight. White has absolutely no way to save both, and will end up down a piece. So, he resigns. A young Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces starts d4 in this next one, and his opponent replies d5. Magnus continues with one of his most powerful openings, c4, the Queen's Gambit, which he has played a whopping 144 times. The Queen's Gambit is traditionally described as a gambit because white appears to sacrifice the c-pawn. However, this could be considered a misnomer as black cannot keep the pawn without incurring a disadvantage. Black chooses c6 to defend while preparing to take the pawn and hold on to it with b5. White fights for the center with knight f3 and black replies knight f6. After knight c3, black releases the tension, capturing on c4. Magnus, realizing that he must stop b5, plays a4. Black's bishop f5 develops while trying to get his bishop outside of the pawn chain were he to play e3. But white hunts the bishop with knight h4, and the bishop has a change of heart, retreating to d7 to instead support the b5 pawn advance. Black's claim is that white's knight on the rim is grim. White follows with e3, awakening the bishop's gaze on c4, and black defends his pawn with b5. Now there's no need for white to take the pawn on b5 just yet. He prefers to maintain the irritable tension and returns his knight towards the center. Then black plays queen b6, supporting his pawn chain. Magnus charges his knight forward, hitting the bishop, with the idea of playing queen f3 to pin the c6 pawn to the rook, enabling a capture on b5. Black, afraid of this, retreats his bishop to c8, planning to protect the long diagonal, and with black's one backward step, white spots a clever combination. He captures the pawn on b5, and after black recaptures, he takes it, sacrificing his knight. Now black doesn't have to accept the offer, but he's about to lose his second pawn and would have all sorts of problems to deal with. So he caves and takes the knight. Magnus's idea behind his marvelous move comes to light. He takes the pawn on c4, using the support of his knight to attack both the queen and the pawn on f7. queen b4 check would not bode well, as it would just allow white to develop with tempo. So black drops the queen back to b7, and white grabs the pawn on f7 with his bishop, forcing the black king into the heat of a wild central battle. White quickly activates his other bishop with the intent of hunting the king further. Black could play a5 and capture the bishop were it to take the pawn, giving back a little material to slow down the attack. But he instead plays e6 to open up his bishop, and here is where things go from bad to worse for black. Magnus swoops his bishop to a5 with check, and the king has no other choice but e7. White's queen emerges with the subtle threat of queen a3 leading to checkmate. So black moves his knight to d5, giving his king an escape square. Yet, this leaves e8 undefended, and the queen jumps there instead, drawing near the black king. The king flees to f6. Knight g4 check lures the king towards its dim demise after king g5. White hits the king again with h4, sacrificing his knight. While the black king could go to f5, things would not end well. White would sacrifice the bishop to allow his queen onto h5 with check. This would force the king to e4, at which point white would play rook d1, stopping the king from going any further. And even though black could delay things, the threat of f3 checkmate would be unstoppable. So, black takes the second sacrifice, but this gives white a checkmate in 3. Can you find it? With the black king having veered a little too far, the move Magnus plays is bishop takes e6 check, and black, understanding that it's just all over, resigns. His only continuation would be taking the bishop, after which white would recapture with the queen, forcing the king to h5. The ending would be a glorious g4 checkmate. It feels a little unfair for this opening to be so high up among Magnus's favorites, since it's only one move. But how could I not include the one he plays in this game, c4, the English opening, which he has played 171 times. This opening fights for the center by staking a claim to the d5 square from the wing. It's considered flexible since it has not committed any of the central pawns just yet. Black replies e5, putting a pawn in the center, and white's knight c3 is followed by knight f6. Knight f3 attacks the e5 pawn, so black defends with knight c6. White continues e4, gaining ground in the center while opening up his bishop, and black moves his bishop to c5, paving the lane for a castle. Magnus follows with a nice tactic. He takes the pawn on e5, giving away his knight once black takes it, putting the knight and bishop in the ideal formation to be forked by the d-pawn. Black saves his bishop, pinning the white knight to its king, so that once white takes the knight with an attack on black's knight, black can capture on e5 since white's knight is immobile. White's knight is also under fire twice, so white moves his queen to f3 where it defends and counterattacks. Black captures with his knight, doubling white's pawns after he recaptures, and black retreats his attacked bishop to e7. Magnus cunningly carries his queen to g3, attacking g7 and planning to meet black castling with bishop h6 threatening checkmate, which would at least win the exchange once the g-pawn would move. Black instead plays g6 right away, and white replies with bishop h6, completely curbing black's right to castle. So black plays d6, opening up his queenside bishop, making arrangements to castle queenside. White develops his bishop to e2, and black develops his to e6. Then white moves his rook to the d-file in line with the enemy queen, who leaps one square, making way for a long castle. White doesn't make things easy though, as he captures the pawn on d6, and while black could recapture with the bishop, white would reply queen h4, cutting off the queenside castle too, and black wouldn't really be able to block with the bishop because of the pin to the queen. So black instead takes back with the pawn, slightly weakening his queenside garrison. Once black's king is put in a dicey situation, Magnus finally takes care of his own king, castling it behind the comfort of a sturdy construction. After black castles, white's bishop has fulfilled its duty in preventing the kingside castle, so it drops back to e3, attacking a7. Black moves his queen to a4, defending and attacking the a2 pawn. Now queen takes a2 would attack the bishop, so white plays the double-edged queen f3, defending his bishop and preparing rook b1 to coordinate with his queen on b7. Also, black's queen takes a2 wouldn't bring with it a threat anymore, so white would meet that with rook a1, skewering the queen and the pawn behind her. So black cautiously retreats his queen to c6, offering an exchange. As the side attacking, Magnus dodges the trade, moving Her Majesty to f4. Black saves his a-pawn by blunting the diagonal with b6. This is followed by the immediate a4, looking to shatter the queenside. Black can't really stop this, so he lifts his rook to defend the 7th rank laterally. White pushes his pawn to the front line, offering it as tribute, and black doesn't want to give white the open a-file by letting him capture, so he accepts the pawn and white takes the open b-file with his rook instead. In an attempt to fight back, black plays rook c7, adding an attacker to the c-pawn. Magnus thrusts forward with c5, and the threat now is bishop b5, which would force the queen away from the defense of the d-pawn. So black captures on c5 with his pawn, opening up the queen's gaze near the enemy king. White follows with bishop f3, hitting the queen, and black must try to eliminate this bishop as its commanding control over the long diagonal will be devastating. He should try a move like bishop d5. Instead, he moves his queen to d6, offering another exchange, which white serenely sidesteps while creating a battery aimed at the queenside. Now black is in a whole lot of trouble. Queen a8 is a brutal threat which would win a full rook, and the only way black could stop it is by giving away material. Instead, black tries rook d8 so that his rook would be defended after the king dodges the check. Yet once black's fingers leave the rook and he presses the clock ending his turn, he realizes that this move was actually a fatal mistake for an entirely different reason. He resigns the game because he is sure that Magnus knows the best move. Can you find white's winning move here? White was not only threatening queen a8 last move, but something else, and something much worse for his opponent. The move Magnus would play is rook b8, sacrificing the rook. If black would take, then queen a8 would be checkmate. Otherwise, white would meet king d7 with queen a4 check, which would force the rook to block. He would take it, forcing the queen to recapture. Then he would play rook b7 check, and were the black king to flee, then white would take the queen for free. But were the king to stay nearby, then white would play bishop f4 check, luring the king towards his end, as rook d1 checkmate would bring down the curtains on this game. In the penultimate game, Magnus has the black pieces and meets e4 with e5. Knight f3 attacks the pawn and knight c6 defends. Then white plays bishop b5 the Ruy Lopez, to which Magnus replies with his second favorite opening and one he's played 183 times, a6 the Morphy Defense. The Morphy Defense of the Ruy Lopez puts the question to the white bishop, and black must decide whether he will give up the bishop pair for the knight or retreat, which is what white does in the game. This allows black at some point to break the bishop's attack with b5. Black for now proceeds development with knight f6 attacking e4, and white castles preparing to meet knight takes e4 with d5 trying to open up the e-file and rook e1 pinning the knight to the king. Black avoids this playing b5 with an attack on white's bishop and opening up the square for his own bishop to enter the game. After white drops the bishop back to b3, black puts his bishop on the long diagonal before white develops his knight to c3 protecting his pawn. Magnus continues bishop e7 preparing to castle, and white plays d3 solidifying his center while opening up his bishop. Black castles, and in light of black's option to play knight a5 going after the bishop, white plays a6 giving his bishop a bunker. Then black hops his knight to d4, sacrificing his pawn on e5. White could take it, but then black would take the bishop on b3, severely damaging white's pawn structure, and getting the bishop pair. The position would soon open up after a move like d5, and black's bishops would come to life. White opts for capturing the knight instead, and black recaptures. This gains some central space, but the black pawn is slightly overextended and could become a target after a move like knight e2. But white chooses to jump forward with knight d5. Magnus captures the knight and white recaptures with the pawn. Black follows with c5, fastening his pawn into place, and white's pawn could be difficult to defend, so he gets rid of it by capturing en passant. Black recaptures with his pawn, undoubling the d-pawns. After white's rook e1 taking the open e-file, he pushes c5 again, securing his advanced d-pawn and opening up his monster bishop. White plays a4, trying to open the a-file for his rook, and black moves his bishop to d6, joining his partner in staring down the enemy kingside. White brings his queen to h5 in an attempt to create attacking chances of his own, and black lifts his queen to c7, making a battery aimed at h2. Then white pushes c3, trying to break free from black's stranglehold in the center. Magnus's relentless offense continues as he pushes c4, hitting the bishop. White should avoid capturing the pawn because black would recapture and play d3 next, getting a connected passed pawn. So white drops his bishop to c2, where once the pawn in front of it would move, the bishop could coordinate with his queen in threatening queen h7 checkmate. This is why black plays g6, blunting the diagonal and hitting the queen. She retreats to h3. Then black captures on c3, and were white to recapture, black would take the pawn on d3, which would open up his queen to win the pawn on c3. So white instead captures on b5, and black strikes with a stunning move, rook e8. If white were to exchange rooks, then black would recapture, threatening a back rank checkmate. White would have to move his dark squared bishop, allowing black to win the pawn on b2 while hitting the rook. He would then push c3, getting two crushing connected passed pawns. So white plays rook e3, ensuring his rook is defended. Magnus captures on b2, and after the bishop recaptures, he pushes his c3 pawn, attacking the bishop, while getting it awfully close to its coronation. The bishop retreats before black takes on b5, going up a pawn. White exchanges rooks, and black recaptures, gaining control of the a-file. Circumstances grow alarming for white, with black's incredibly active pieces. White tries bishop b3 to stop the rook's infiltration of the second rank. But black had a devastating threat, and white did nothing to prevent it. Can you find black's winning move? The rook and the bishop on the same diagonal is a sign that there are tactics, and the move Magnus plays is bishop f4, skewering the two pieces. White drops his rook back to e1, but after black releases his rook onto a1, white resigns. There is absolutely no way to defend the pinned bishop, and black will be up a full piece to add to his already dominant position. In the final game, Magnus has the white pieces and starts e4. Black replies e5, and white develops the knight to f3, attacking the pawn, so black defends with knight c6. Then Magnus unveils his all-time favorite opening, and one he's played a staggering 283 times throughout his career, bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez. White's third move attacks the knight that defends the e5 pawn from the attack by white's knight. Black replies a6, attacking the bishop, and we notice that although white could take the knight, after black recaptures with his d-pawn, white taking the e5 pawn would be met by queen d4, hitting the knight and winning back the pawn. Magnus calmly retreats the bishop, keeping an eye on the knight. Black plays knight f6, attacking e4, and white castles so that if the knight were to take the pawn, he could skewer the knight and the pawn with his rook. b5 hits the bishop, forcing it back to b3. Then black places his bishop on the long diagonal, indirectly adding a second attacker to e4. White fortifies his center with d3 while opening up his queenside minor pieces. Black's bishop c5 develops with an aggressive stance, peering at the king, and white brings his knight out to c3. Black follows with d6, creating a sturdy central pawn chain. At this moment, Magnus strikes on the queenside with a4, threatening to capture twice on b5. Black shouldn't capture the pawn because it would give white the open a-file. So he moves the knight to a5, hitting white's potent bishop, who retreats to a2 before black plays b4, pushing the knight back to e2. White's plan is to reroute the knight towards the king side, and with black's bishop staring at concrete, black drops it back to c8 where it can pick off an intrusive knight. Then white plays c3 with the plan of creating a powerful central pawn duo. Black captures the pawn, and after white recaptures, he retreats his bishop to b6 in anticipation of white's d4. Magnus doesn't push just yet, as it would hang his e4 pawn. He maneuvers his knight to g3, guarding the pawn and looking to leap forward. Black continues bishop e6, challenging white's bishop, and he wouldn't mind a capture, as his doubled pawns would do well in boxing out the enemy knight. But white avoids capturing. He thrusts forward in the center with d4. Black should probably castle here, but he decides to capture the bishop on a2, arguing that after white recaptures, his rooks are disconnected and hence out of place. Then black castles, and white plays bishop g5, creating a devastating pin because it just cannot be broken. h6 followed by g5, for example, would be met by a knight sacrifice and the pin re-emerging. White would have the resources to continually add attackers, while black would be unable to defend. Instead, black captures on d4, hoping to make use of the open e-file. Magnus's persistent pressure proceeds, with knight h5, adding an attacker to the knight. Black hopelessly captures a second pawn, and at this point, white has a plan that wins the game. Can you find the winning plan? The move Magnus plays is knight h4, opening up his queen. Now the threat is bishop takes f6, and once the pawn would recapture, white would storm in with his queen, giving check via the open g-file, leading to a checkmate in 2 on g7 with the support of his knight. So black is forced to move the king to h8, getting it off the g-file. But white had another threat, and that is the move he plays next, knight f5. Black stares despondently at the board while doing a short calculation before throwing in the towel and resigning. White's move adds a second attacker to the g7 pawn, which is pivotal as it defends the pinned knight. White's going to take the pawn, then win the knight for free while hitting the queen and threatening decisive discovered checks on the king. Even if black were to defend the pawn with the rook, white would take it anyway, winning even more material once he would capture the knight, hitting the queen and pinning the rook to the king. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.